questions. So Roxane, she's a professor in University of Montreal, and she is well interested in social psychology and understanding the social events on people in her work. She has general information training and identity, and also ethnicity and intercultural concerning immigration. She studied in Mongolia, well, all over in the world, but mostly with the indigenous people. And recently, she associated herself with local organisms to launch this intercom project to community prevention. So if you would like more information, you can find it on her website. I'm going to put the link in the chat. So Roxane, it's up to you to allow Maryse to start. I think we're missing one speaker, and reminding everybody, once again, we are interpreting and simultaneously. So remember, we have an interpreter. So good morning, Martin. Thank you very much for the welcome. Thank you for this great organization of this conference. We also work on dialogue, how to talk to each other during conflicts or tough times, but I'm sure everything's going to be good. We had a very interesting informal discussion, so I hope that you have a great roundtable this morning with us. So we have 5 presenter, speaker, and first of all, I'm going to present them to you, and then we will start with Maryse Potvin. So Maryse, she's a professor in sociology, ethnicity report at UQAM in Montreal. She's in a chair France-Québec on the contemporary issues of freedom of speech and founder of the International Network Education and Diversity and the Observatory of Diversity and Equity. You also co-direct, and you are a member of la chaire UNESCO Preventing Radicalization of Violent Extremists, and also a very big bio. For more than 25 years, Maryse Potvin works on ethnic reports, racism, equity, and inclusion. So it's a real pleasure, Maryse, to have you with us today. We also have Luc Simard, who is an expert in advice, equity, diversity, inclusion. So good morning, Luc. And in relations with the Indigenous, so you've worked for about 30 years at HxCanada and 10 years as a diversity director. And at that job, he was bringing novelties that were underrepresented in the population and the personnel of the French network. I would love to see the stats, Luc, on that. And you also used your influence for CBC Canada also. You took part in the setting up of strategy EDI. So this is good. It's going to help us to get back on our feet. Before investing yourself in this domain, you were a journalist and manager of shows on radio and TV. So welcome to this roundtable. After that, in order, Murielle Chatelier got a degree in communication at Université de Montréal, president and co-founder of the United Quebecers United Against Racism. This organism is to promote a vision to vivre ensemble true to the Quebec and universality. So, good morning, Murielle. Where am I? Bilkis Vissandjée, professor. Is she there, Bilkis? Bilkis, good morning. She's a teacher in the science of nursing in Université de Montréal, researcher at the Sherpa University Center, public health, and also in the International Center of Research of Université de Montréal. She is interested in the strategies of EDI and in her function as a president at the provincial committee for the giving of social services for people issued from ethnocultural people. You have such great bios. and in health, and as a member of the policies committee and ADE in a share of research and smaller committee on support unit SSA Quebec. And finally, we have Arnaud Bernadet. Are you there? But good morning. He's a teacher on the literature department and translation creation of the McGill University, and he published a book co-written with Isabelle Arsenault, Social Justice and Freedom in the university, and many writings on the inclusive culture, cancel culture, and he is working on the EDI. So welcome, everybody. It's a real pleasure to see you again this morning, and we're going to start with Maryse Potvin. Maryse, you ready? All right, I'm the lucky one, so I'll be starting off this discussion. So thank you very much for this invite. I would like just to remind you the origins. Like we think that this is a recent movement, but it's not recent. And we can remember in the 80s, we had an inquiry commission, Canadian, on racism and the Canadian community. It was called ABELA Commission. And they were looking on the inequality between different groups. And back then, we didn't have this notion that was introduced further in the Census Canada of the visible minority. So it was really complicated to analyze the injustice or inequalities between the majority group, we would call white, and the people from minorities that were race. We call them raced before, but this term was used in the report of the commission, ABELA Commission, and people who were victims of racism or they are discriminated. So even then, preoccupation of the judge, ABELA judge, would have more data that would be more precise and to adapt systemic tools to fight this systemic discrimination. So what followed this is the law and equity for jobs in 1986, and the notion of visible minority who had so many consultations, nonprofit users, researchers throughout Canada was adopted. And even if I think that it didn't please everybody, so it was adopted in a consensus way because it would allow as a tool to measure the separation between riches like lodging, jobs, all the differences between those different groups in the Quebec population. So adopting the law for equity job-wise, adopting for Stat Canada on the visible minorities starting in the 90s, I think. And at the same time, simultaneously, we had a big evolution in the prudence in the people's right, and we went from direct discrimination to the indirect discrimination and the notion of reasonable accommodation through a judgment that was talking about women against Canadian Pacific Company. So this defined this systemic definition of what was systemic. And when we see some inequality, or let's say for religious holidays or handicapped people, any way the charter could be discriminated on. So for whatever the language or other, and these markers of discrimination, when we notice a discrimination, we need to accommodate the people in the limits of their excessive constraints to not create them for organization, in cost or violation of people's right or public safety. So it was any conditions So all this was done in the 80s. Even intersectionalities was invented or created about at the same time, I think in 89, with Kimberly Crenshaw wrote an article in the States that was saying in the law, when we examine a cause, there's many reason of like you're a handicapped Black woman. It could increase and reflect a situation that is not just one motive. So we started in 80s and 90s in the States, and I think the Ontarian Commission of the Rights that adopted this perspective of intersectionality to analyze these cases in front of the tribunals, to say that it's not just the color that is there, but the gender and other motives. And today, these notions made their way, like we know, in the actuality, but it's not something new. It's been more than 30, 40 years that these concepts were introduced at the same time in jurisprudence, in the laws, in the social sciences, because in law also, because the authors in social science were using this concept of the minority racistic group, which take in quite an expansion since. And in education, when we talk about the inclusive approach in elementary, high school, we needed to adapt this in the school milieu around the handicapped or difficulty in learning or any kind of support for the students that had more difficulties. And after that, internationally, it made their way. And this inclusive approach was a normative discourse. So at the beginning of the 2000, we had a worldwide forum on equity in education in Dakar, who adopted an action plan on an inclusive approach that was standing on the objective of education throughout the life and for development, and UNESCO made that their guiding lines in the middle of 2005, and the United Nations in their agenda introduced these inclusive approach in the global education, and still today in the sustainable program adopted it for 2030. So it's anything new, but it's embedded in the normative discourse international and even at the UNESCO level. UNESCO proposed to countries to elaborate national action plans to elaborate to operate this inclusive national report, including indicators, different objectives, social, cultural, etc. And all this to guide these learning establishments to establish local plan on these principles. So with these principles were inspired from this equity notion, which isn't new, but it replaced mostly an education, intercultural approach, multicultural. So it replaced this civic approach and citizenship, but anti-racist, anti-oppression. That was a most critical approach, but it was there in the 70s in the schools, HxCA PGM in back then, or either English or French network. And the equity notion finally is talking a bit more or requires more from the institution to adapt themselves to the reality, the needs of the most vulnerable people in a certain way, the minority that are more visible. So talking about people who just they arrive in Quebec, they don't speak French, so give them a language support. This seems normal today, but that's equity. Find ways to support in in, how can I say, to support groups or students or people who are learning who have more difficulties, to help them attain equality. So it's an aim of attaining equality, because institutions will set in place a way that will allow accommodation to groups that are more vulnerable. Let's say they're poor, difficulty of learning, and other reasons. So we need to take in case these realities to favorize learning with full equity, to have results, success in education. So this approach is legal because, in a certain way, by taking in account the reality of the needs, we take care of the rights through a lecture that is targeted to the, it's not the student to adapt himself, but it's the institution that need to adapt to the school. So there's a paradigm change, and this action should be a continuous, acts on the rights of the people, and also their power to act, to so this is the lecture that I make of it. So this approach that is acts on non-discrimination and recognize the differences, centered on the students, on the people, and also an approach of participation and social transformation and institutional that is acts on the vivre ensemble, live together on a society that's pluralist, democratic, right of social justice and the right. So these two finality is the foundation of an inclusive approach. So maybe a last detail, I don't want to take too long, but right after this, I give the floor. What to have diagnosed a tool that are precise on their reality and their needs of these people. So we need major consultations, statistic analysis, indicators to say, okay, what are the problems we find, and to adapt for the teachers and the students, and also in the administrations, the way you will manage the cases and tests or exams, which are the diagnostics of these indicators of following up, and also indicators of results we are aiming for in an inclusive approach in a sustainable way, so that the institution may continually adopt themselves. These are the basic principles. I don't say that it's working and it works all the time, but we need a lot of leadership, because we need a will of the milieu to adapt and transform their practices. So we need practical communities that are working to elaborate these local indicators for each of these institutions to make this way efficient. So I'm going to stop here, and we may talk about it a bit more. So thank you, Maryse. So it's 19, so good. Perfect timing. Let's go to Luc. Luc Simard, it's all yours. Thank you, Roxane. And thank you, Maryse, also for opening and explain where these questions of EDI came from. My experience and my speech in a few minutes and the participation to the debate, it's going to be from an environment that is very different from the majority of these participants of the roundtable, and maybe a great part of the people listening, because I'm not in the university milieu. So I'm from the media for more than 40 years, in a great part to Radio-Canada. And my personal journey is as a journalist and a redactor and directors of show, up until I I go towards these questions that we were calling them diversity, and that's how it was called before. And then at the end of my career a few months ago in Radio-Canada, and this was full-time activity, and I think we were behind on the university aspect, calling EDI. And I'm going to explain a bit, not only myself, but the organization like CBC, Radio-Canada, found out that this question was vital for the future, and we're far from being the only media to become aware of this, because the whole of the media that we would call traditional, legacy media, if you want, realized in the past years that these media couldn't continue with the same representation in the interns. So how the staff was composed on, and the journalists aspect of people working there. So we've noticed that Effective wasn't representing and was getting more far and far from the citizens that we want to serve. So all the medias want to be popular. All media want to have people listening, reading, or watching. And I spend my life in the electronics media, so mostly in radio and television. So we want to have listeners. And I would say that CBC, Radio-Canada, which is a public sector, it's like direct financed by the government, but financed by the federal government for the 2/3 of his revenue, and get commercial revenues for the 1/3. So this is a public media, and they want to serve the Canadian people. So we've noticed in our backyard and other big private media, I think about the Globe and Mail, that is a newspaper that I read every day. They realized that they had to connect themselves more and more on our public, on the citizen, because the demographic composition of the citizens was changing really rapidly. So, but within the media, Effective, the change was not at the same speed. So it's tough to get into this. It's tough to break these barriers, and if you want to become journalist or author or TV shows or animator, talk show host, or whatever you want, as CBC Radio-Canada, we do not fabricate only information, but that's what I did for my career. But we do make entertainment shows and series, and that you are watching, probably part of you. So in all these domain of our production, that's difficult to get in the environment. So these demographic change made us take decisions within our environment. So maybe I will diminish the importance, but at the beginning, it was only a legal consideration. So Marie's talked about that on the equity job-wise. So a media like Radio-Canada, because he is in the TV and radio, so it's a federal competency. So under the federal law on equity for hiring, and that's the difference between like TVA or Québécois. So it's this environment of TV radio, which is a federal competency. So we need to respect the laws and the regulations of the federal. So we needed to have some kind of a picture of our environment. We have designed groups. So let's go back in 1986, more than 40 years. So women, and by the way, I'm going to say it because women, we are about equal in like CBC Radio-Canada in every job except maybe more technique. In IT, there's some small issues, but like information, women constitutes not half of the effectives, and also in the management sector also. So if we talk about Radio-Canada, talk about the French services, what you know in French, the information of these French services is led by a woman. So this is, we acquired this after 40 years of this law. We have parity with a woman in most of the sectors of CBC Radio-Canada, but it's not the case, and it's far from being the case for other design groups. This is the way we say, like Indigenous, handicapped, people with disability, and people we call a visible minority, that this is an invention, original invention, but still the term we are using in the law. So with this on the internal composition of environment in Radio-Canada. So at the end of my journey in Radio-Canada, I quit in end of December. We were talking about my visible minority. We were like 1/10. So 10% that would identify themselves. It needs to be self-identification, and they should tell us how they see them, and the 10% were saying that was part of the visible minority, which is not that bad, but it's not less than the population. But when we look at the people with a handicap, it's less than 2%. Indigenous is not even 1.5%, so it's under that. I'm talking about Radio-Canada, so French services. It's not what we would like. And even after so many years, it's not a success. So we have a long way to go. When we compare ourselves with other Canadian media, it's not better. So Canadian Journalist Association, they do for the last 2 years, and they do a survey where the news are written throughout Canada. So French and English, 5,000 journalists, and last year's numbers that we're going to get this year a bit further later, I mean, gives us that in 8 of these redaction rooms out of 10, we don't have journalists other than white. So there's no black journalists or no one who are Spanish or Latinos. So 8 out of 10 are white, have no journalists that we could consider, even if we don't like this expression, visible minority. The proportion of white journalists increased between 21 and 22. Why did it increase? Well, it's simple. It's the results of the crisis situation that the media is going through. So when we talk about it, we really notice quickly that people who are not in the media, they don't see that there is a existential crisis for many years now, and there is a reduction of the journalist jobs in the whole of Canadian. It's less the case for CBC Radio-Canada, which is much more stable than the average, but there are less journalists coming out, and the last one in were people from other identity. Well, they're the first one to leave because they need to leave and work on their own. So this situation is really important because all the media want to stay connected on their public. And if we lack of representation inside, so information, well, there are subjects that we don't cover. We could cover them, but we could not cover them in the right way. We can misrepresent or bring stereotypes, and sometimes we can say some things that is false without knowing, obviously, but to cover different types of events, but with like a magnifying glass, but with a wrong sense of these events. So I'm going to stop on that. I can talk a bit more later how we see this university debate. You see that in the media, it's another story. Thank you. You're well disciplined this morning. I would have given you a bit more time. So if you want to talk about this, we can wait later, Luc, whatever you prefer. I'm going to wait at the end. Let's see if Bilkis, would you like to talk now? Because she's still there. So Bilkis, would you like, are you there? And so we're going to go with the next person, Murielle Chatelier. So you have the microphone. So good morning, everybody. I myself also, I have a journey in journalism, but it's very, very small. I don't have Luc's experience, but I directly go into the subject and I'll tend to answer the questions. Are we on the right way with EDI? I'm a militant today and you're going to notice. I don't think we're on the right track EDE-wise for many reasons, and I'm going to talk about the reason that represents myself is these programs contribute to the segmentation of the society. So what I noticed that the EDI program are not in the equation of our Vivre Ensemble model in Quebec, which is already based on equality without distinction or preferences on race, sex, or religion, like stipulate the Charter of Rights. The EDI programs right now are linked with the American model or multiculturalism Canadian. So in identity group, aiming the sex, their color and the race. And for me, the individual is reduced to only one of his dimension. It's this way of looking to the society brings pain. And the one that I can see is multiplication of jobs reserved to people from minorities and exclude citizens from the majority group. And in last May, Quebec government and the opposition parties denounced these discrimination from Université Laval in Ottawa for a research job. We were excluding white men with no handicap. So this indignation brought a motion that was brought in December from Pascal Berry, the Minister of Higher Studies, and they wanted the people to express their preoccupation on these criteria that not linked to competency. And this motion was adopted unanimously. So this indignation reached the population in general. According the English Canadian, like we've noticed on different social medias, and this unanimity that was observed throughout the country should ring a bell. So to apply to these jobs reserved to minority group, these candidates that are aimed, they should identify themselves according to their race or any other criteria linked to diversity. But according to me, we're not asking the right questions that I'm going to do today. What do we do in case where people targeted, they don't want to put an X on these boxes to bring the quotas? And if a citizen estimates that characteristic like their race should never be taken in consideration in a job hiring process, what do we do when professionals want to be evaluated only regarding their competency, like we do with their peers? One of the members in our organization is from Cameroon, and mention this to answer these job offered to the minority group, and the only diversity that I will accept is my opinion diversity. I can't even imagine from so many years of studies and work to be the best in what I do. I'm hired because I'm Black. That for me, it's real racism. So by leaving the worst to come here, that's not the Canada I had in mind. End of citation. So without saying that racial discrimination doesn't exist, yes, we know racism, but can we allow ourselves to think today that this discrimination is not as much spread to certain militants would assume? The diagnostic that's brought on our society doesn't really correspond to the reality. Well, at least not as much to have job offers that are discriminatory and creating of safe space also in our university, our cultural environment or work environment to protect the oppressed from their oppressors. And there was a study that was made on the safe space by ex-psychology professor from Harvard, Jim Siganius, and he passed in June 21. And he says that the more people feel safe within a group, the more they become hostile to those who are not part of the group. In 1963, so we're going back in time, in the middle of the fight for civil rights, the 35th President of the United States, Mr. Kennedy, made this promise. And the beginning, next week, he said, I will ask the United States Congress to act and to take a commitment that he never did within this century to reaffirm that the race concept has not his place in the laws and the United States. End of citation. So that's 60 years ago, almost day to day, because I think it was in the spring of that year. And us today in our society that do not share at all the segregation they had in the United States, we bring back this racial context to try to explain all kinds of social phenomena. This concept was obsolete in 1963, but now under social justice, it became acceptable. Where is the spirit of the fight for civil rights, the one that was brought by Martin Luther King and John F. Kennedy? I sincerely think that this discussions like the one we're going to have today will allow us to reflect on what we really wish for our society and to go forward. Do we need these EDI that's mostly on gender and race and bring divisions in our institutions? So once again, like the Alexandre Kalev mentioned yesterday, research shows that these training are not efficient and counterproductive. So if you are listening to us, listen to her intervention yesterday that was recorded, or read her work that is accessible on the internet. So I will summarize my intervention in just for a certain point. First, to be Black is not an accomplishment. Secondly, my race shouldn't play any role in a hiring process. Thirdly, anything that should count is, am I the best person to do the job? 4, I don't want advantages because of my color. 5, I don't want to be chosen to fill up quotas. 6, I want to be respected as an individual, and only my job would be considered on the workforce. In 1964, a bit far, Martin Luther King said in one of his speeches, we are not looking to be disadvantages and not to be privileged, because this would denaturalize justice. We will not replace a tyranny by another, because the Black tyranny is as dangerous as the white tyranny. End of citation. So if you would like to say, I would like the approach more indicative. In 64, he went to the Mecca and revolutionized his view, and he lived a great brotherhood for people of every race. And he talked about racism and started to say, Malcolm X, after the spiritual enlightenment I've received since my last visit to the Mecca, I do not subscribe to any generalized accusation to any race. I can affirm with all sincerity that I wish nothing else than justice, freedom, equality, a free life, and a pursuit of happiness for everybody. And I would like to end by saying this: there is a way to talk about inequalities in the society without reinforcing segregation. I don't think that what is EDI does, it brings another comprehension of the racial issues specific to different organizations. EDI doesn't take in case equality and liberal individualism, the respect of the human person. No, EDI goes into division, and this approach is not on the right track because it spread a certain ideology that brings segregation. And it's we need to find a modern approach that resembles us, and it's not by devising that we'll get there. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Murielle. So let's go to Arnaud. We changed the order of the last two panelists. So up to you, Arnaud. Thank you, and thank you, Murielle, for your position, and your answer is really clear, and it answers the panel's question. I'm going to try maybe to, without repeating everything that has been said, to bring the conversation maybe, and I have certain elements to talk. We all talked about equity, diversity, inclusion. This phenomena, it's a bit hard to grasp, and I hear many things now on hiring policies. I hear things on representation, but EDI is also the workshop of awareness of racism, microaggressions. It's big managers in universities, also businesses, administration. Well, brief, it's widespread. So what are we talking about? And the other observations that I would make, presently, it doesn't exist in Quebec, talking about where I am, a counter discourse from EDI. Everybody says, oh, it's wonderful, equity, diversity, inclusion is the MEC plus ultra. Who could be against this? No one. But when you look at this formula, we see that it's like a slogan, a mantra. And this is probably where the difficulties start. So we question the notion, like diversity. Diversity is not a concept. Diversity is a term that's more or less flexible, but social diversity, this fight, diversity in religion, race, language, etc. Equity, everybody is for that, you know, and to remove obstacle and correct certain inequalities of group that are favorized. Which mechanism are we using? And this is where the argument starts. So EDI is a formula like a tote bag, and everybody finds what they like. And this is what we call inclusion in the communication agencies, in marketing or design. We talk about inclusion. Inclusion is have inclusive messages, and this is how the EDI method works and finds this social efficiency and without any clear definition. So in the university environment, the EDI question started in 2017 with the action plan of EDI from the federal science minister, Kristen Duncan. So in the CRC program, and it was spread to other grants for research. So let me remind you, when the program of these research chair were launched, it was more money for research, but we had complaints, underrepresentation of women, question of minorities also was talked about. So yes, this is proved for quite many years. And when this program was updated after Trudeau in 2015, so 2016 was a pivot year on that. So it's a state measure which is there to correct inequalities in this environment. So it comes with two things that I would like to underline is the other side of the medal, of the coin. So it's also the ingérence of the federal in the competency of the provinces, and the institutional of university directors didn't complain. We didn't hear them. We heard them cry all the tears of their heart, to protect the freedom in Quebec. But when this happened, they didn't say a word. So in this framework, we can see 2-3 things that not only regarding the university, but more general. The first aspect is what is the origins. Mary's mentioned a few elements, but the evolutions or mutation. We replace this on the report 84, the Canadian law in 1986, Equity Act. It's not by chance that it starts by EDI, talking about DEI in the States, is a wink on equity. But we should remember that after the affirmative action politics in the 80s, after the equity programs in Canada that constitute the Canadian side of affirmation, in the business environment, in the theories of managerial products, we have the diversity paradigm that was rooted in the 80s and 90s. The foundation in 1984 of the American Institute for Management Inclusivity. Since the year 2000, 2010, and different types of lectures, we talk about inclusive paradigms, where the formula of EDI with all the variants, ADI, decolonization, JEDI, or the best one, JEDI, may the force of justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. So this is the valse, the dance, and in the business environment, but it does impact the university world. If I look at the EDI White Book of La Chaire for Women in Engineering, we talk about inclusive management. If we talk of the EDI plan of the Laval University, there is questions of inclusive governance. We can't be worse than that. The second element is that these EDIs can't be separated from dynamic or service economy made by expert consultants. So the spectra is really large, from McKinsey that sell their products, I'm not going to say to who, we all know, and absorb all these intersectionality, systemic racism, all this vocabulary to these ONG, also that the network Inter-University Quebec and the Fund of Research Finance money on the practices of EDI throughout the world. So this is the evolution towards this entrepreneurial model. And then the intervention of the states bring these EDI plan. But It's a common known in the companies. We valorize differences, diversity, because they consider a strength or the basis of their performance. So these comment environment, but what's is more curious when you read the Harvard Business Review articles, they talk about grants of research from the federal. So in an inclusive perspectives, we will welcome diversity, different backgrounds, different experience, different perspectives, but we're going to promote it because we know that it's going to be to the base of productivity of the business. Like McKinsey firm talks on that subject. I love inclusive growth. So this is a quite a term, so the human face, we can see that inclusive growth. So in the university world, we're not far from this ideology productivity. We talk about excellence, neoliberal world in 90, but it's an empty world. Everything that managed the quality could be there, and logically we're hearing about inclusive excellence. So it seems that, and I will end on that, we see two major difficulties, clear conflict in the university between the managerial model and the collegial model. We need to remind a university is not a business. A university is a college of professors. So this is the first point. A simple example. In Concordia, we need to profile the jobs, and they would see the problem coming, and this should be to the college of the professor to who's going to get which job. But if we have targets to attain, well, then it's the administration committee that will decide. Second point is the nature of justice that is set in place. EDI, I'm sorry, but until you prove me wrong, they are most exclusively on the gender and the race. And the thing that was forgotten from the policies is the socio-economical inequality. There's nothing on that. Or, you mention under the terms, but we need to bring back, we can be lesbian from or be trans and coming from a low income family. So how do you articulate this? So they're all legitimate, but on the EDI plan is not founded on these criteria of the socioeconomic inequalities. So and the last problem, and I'm going to stop on that, is a framework ideologically framed, vertically set. And this is the one that brings us really far in the hiring policies. Why a demander of grant in engineering and science needs to declare mandatorily his race to the organism? Why does someone who would ask a subvention at CRSH would to agree to the EDI rules and practices on the basis that concepts that are, white normativity, intersectionality, concepts that don't really apply to the field of research, doesn't apply of what they're doing. And these concepts, like anything, we can bring them a priori, they need to be discussed. Now, there's a fact of techniques of control, orientation. So we're really far from a freedom of research. By definition, you can't orient it. We can have different teams, yes, and give grants on that, but there's a real problem on that. So these are the things I've suggest. So I'll leave my place. Yeah, hi, and thank you. Can you hear me well? Yes, we can hear you well. So I had small issues. Thank you to my colleagues to have presented majority all the arguments. And it's a challenge when you're the last one to talk, but I can certainly build on all these elements that were represented up until now. And I'm a Roxane. I'm going to do your job to try to resume, and I'll let you build on the points to remember, the conclusions before we go ahead with the debate or conversation. So we understand really well that for so many years, we had the occasions of think EDI without naming EDI. Also, we indicated that EDI is an acronym that each and every one of us tried to deconstruct depending on our experience and our journeys. We also mentioned that many people finally agitate themselves since 2017. Diversity to set in place some kind of an action plan towards approach and strategies that are inclusive in all the domains of a company, from governance, direction, HR, everything that was mentioned from my colleagues, making sure that everybody find a form of place for them in teaching, research, and as far as I'm concerned, the clinical practice in institution of health and social services. So the imperatives of these initiatives requires, like we heard, that the functioning plans would attribute resource. So it's a bit like we were talking about resource, like human resource. Everybody talked about it. Financial resource, we need it. Is it the case? It's a question we need to ask. But did we invest in that sense? And the other point that I wish we would talk in our discussion is the mechanisms of the novatrice, novel performance towards changes that what I'm hearing and what I'm reading systemic. So in the identification of the obstacles that were mentioned in different sectors from my colleagues, well, it would to target these awareness effort. What do we mean? Weren't we doing it open? No, we think I'm making ADI. What does that mean? I don't know, but everybody in all these instances are doing EDI. So maybe we should come back to what does that mean? Are we more aware? Do we valorize, and we take the time to valorize diversity? And what I take, and I'm going to build on this, is the growth, productivity, excellence from my colleagues that mentioned with great eloquence, and is these with these lectures that I have preparing and in my day-to-day life. And thank you, Murielle, for bringing up certain questions. So without any sensibility or awareness to EDI, and maybe we'll have a debate on these acronyms, without a sensibility to EDI, can we really attain, Arnaud, I'm going to talk to you, can we attain excellence? So many people talked about excellence. So what does that mean? And for us, researcher and practitioner, we do, like you really mentioned, the presence of researcher in their journey, their different journeys, and also to ask questions and solutions that would be bold, also to take into account these experience and to be at ease to do it. So can we say that we need EDI to reach excellency, in which we produce in type of research, and after that it would be applied, who knows, these practices of EDI? So we could ask the question, and this is why today were present, talking about looking at different obstacles with lens approaches that are different. So in the last 2-3 minutes I have is I would like to come back to equity communities when we're talking about the usage of knowledge that came out of research and taking in account diversity. And what I would wish to bring in this conversation as a person who is professional in healthcare is I didn't what regulates our clinical practice. So first of all, we have like the umbrella in which we have the civil code. We're directed by the civil code who asked to act harmoniously with the charters of right and the general law principles, and many of you talked about them, the reports between people, and what constitute these rules that make of us people that can work together and respect. And I think that we need to preoccupy ourselves to register ourselves in these condition, and after that brings back the professional codes, the importance to make sure that everybody is consenting in equity and conversations of EDI. If the person doesn't speak nor English or French, we need to give them services, and they need to agree to our services. So for me, make sure that I do my job properly, and I need to have resources and ways. If my institution didn't have interpretation resource that I can use, well, of course I can be aware of the EDI, but if I can't apply what constitute to make sure that I have a clear consentment from a person who is really vulnerable, we should think bigger than just the words and put the actions in place. So this responsibility that comes back to our practical code or professional code. So this is what I wanted to add of these different points that are brought by my colleagues. Thank you, Roxane, to help us to set the table for this discussion. And as the last one who spoke, thank you, Dr. Drapeau, who shook us a bit to be present and yesterday also and today. So the challenge, Dr. Drapeau, is that you will take it up with us also. So thank you, Bilkis.